Hey, Steph, and whoever might end up listening to this. I guess I was asked to look at this video on whether or not the history of the West is in fact Judeo-Christian, or if that is a lie or a misrepresentation of things. This is not a polished video. I'm just giving my kind of knee-jerk responses as I go through it, so I'm going to cut this down, obviously, because it's 3 hours long, and try and tighten my responses up. And I'm not an expert in the fields of archaeology or ancient history of Israel, so what I can do is perhaps direct those who are interested and hopefully provide some counterpoints, if they're appropriate, to some of the arguments that might be being made here regarding the history and archaeology and legitimacy, I suppose, of the biblical accounts. So, with no further ado, I'm just going to launch into it, and we'll kind of jump through and look at particular arguments as we go. So that's what we're going to do. Here we go.
Civilization is based on Judeo-Christian values, and without that, we would have nothing.
Judeo-Christian values are predicated on the existence of a God of morality. The entire Western world, what we call Western civilization, is based on this understanding.
The values.
Love the polish. Certainly, you've really stepped up your game there, Steph, in the last number of years, so well done on that.
That resonate most with human beings are eternal, not changeable, and not relativistic. They are universal. They are not group specific. And most of all, they apply to individual human beings, not group labels. And those values were first embedded clearly and concisely in the Ten Commandments.
Of course, this is a beautiful idea, eternal values that are not group specific. But of course, these values only came from one place. And these influencers are wont to remind us of that at every opportunity, despite us Westerners being the vessel that brings these Judeo-Christian values to the entire world and saves everyone on the planet. We are not the source. We must learn to humble ourselves.
It's a bit of a misrepresentation there, and I'm sure that Steph knows what he's saying, and it's true that in the later period of history, it was the West which predominantly brought Christian ideas and values across the globe. But if you know your history, then you know that, in fact, Christianity did spread south and east as well as west. And so there was obviously not a great deal of spread from the Ethiopian Christian communities further southward. There was not a lot of avenue for interaction between the Ethiopians and sub-Saharan African tribes that was peaceful, that's for sure. But as you go east, you certainly do find that Christianity spreads very significantly to the east, sometimes called the Nestorian Church, which is a bit of a misrepresentation of what that church was. But it's argued by many that the larger population of Christianity until probably 1000 AD was east of the Euphrates River. And I think a lot of people don't realize that I think it was in the 8th century that the Chinese Tang dynasty actually built 100 Christian cathedrals on the government dime. The Cariates tribe that Genghis Khan took over as his initial sort of launch pad into dominating Mongolia, and from there the rest of the world was Christian. It was like nationally Christian, and about half of the Mongol horde was, according to the Eastern brand of Christianity. Now that did die out largely in the subsequent centuries, but it is still, I think, worth noting that it is a bit of a misrepresentation that the West was the source of Christianity and its ideals. It really was universal, but when you do look into the Eastern Church, it was subjugated and subdued over the second millennia, and particularly because in the East, following the Mongol dynasty, which was very generous to Christianity for obvious reasons, because Kublai Khan's grandmother and wife, I believe, were both Christians. And so he was very sympathetic to Christianity, but the subsequent emperor who took over following the Mongol dynasty, and I'd have to look at the dates, but I think it's in the 15th century, might have been the 14th, that they were pretty hard on Christianity in China, and so it was very badly repressed and suppressed. But really at about the same time that the West was starting to arrive in the East, revitalizing Christianity not only in China but in other places, introducing it in places like the Philippines. So yeah, the West did definitely in the latter part of the second millennium become the primary source of missionaries going across the world, but it isn't really fair to say that the West was the ones who shaped what Christianity would be or what its ideals would be as it spread around the globe. Maybe to the extent that we recognize it today through its predominantly Catholic and Reformed traditions, which certainly do dominate the expression of Christian values in the world. So we'll agree with that.
Joel Berry, the editor at Babylon Bee, put it this way. Western civilization, says Joel, began on Mount Sinai. This is, of course, the moment during Exodus where Moses had the 10 Commandments revealed to him by the one true God, which he then brought to the world in order to teach the one true religion. And until that prophecy reached us, we Europeans, we Westerners, we were barbarians. We were living in mud huts. We were amoral, master moralists, engaging in horrible acts, human sacrifice, living in darkness, full of hate in our hearts, hating the truth, hating civility itself. We were only saved when Judeo-Christian culture made its way into our bosom. Well, what if I was to tell you that Joel Berry's belief that Western civilization began on Mount Sinai is not only wrong on its face, but wrong on a deeper level? What if Judeo-Christian civilization did not even begin on Mount Sinai? You see, over the last 100 years, there has been ample opportunity for many different scholars to go into Sinai and Egypt and Israel and try to excavate these regions to discover hard proof that something like Exodus and Moses actually happened. Now, many of these researchers were hardcore American evangelicals. Many of them are Israeli. They both really want to find hard proof because their identity depends upon this. But
Yeah, so I'm just going to interject here and say, I think where he's going with this, and the argument that there is very little evidence for a Christian, or not Christian, but a Jewish exodus of the Israelites who are Yahwehists, who are traveling through the desert at that time. Yeah, well, and certainly if you're looking at 2 million people, that's possibly a legitimate complaint. It is hard to excavate the desert. Sinai, its actual location is not really known. There's, the nearest that you can come is where people thought it was about 1400 years later. But yeah, okay, so I guess what I would challenge is whether or not that means that our identity rests on archaeological proof that these things happened. It would perhaps be challenged by archaeological proof that they didn't happen, but let's hear them out.
despite this, their searches have come up barren. The scholarly consensus that has emerged based on the evidence that they find in archaeological research is that Exodus, Moses, and the beginning of the Old Testament, which is Deuteronomy, simply did not happen the way it is told in the Bible.
Well, I'll challenge that. The scholarly consensus among scholars who reject Exodus is that Exodus didn't happen. But to say that the scholarly consensus is that it didn't happen is false. There are many credible, equally qualified archaeologists and scholars who say there is evidence that it happened. But let's hear what he has to say.
Looks like Moses and the revelations of the Ten Commandments given to the chosen people were fabrications, myths deployed by later political regimes in order to establish legitimacy. But it gets much worse, because if you pull out this foundation stone, it brings a lot of things into question. And more recent archaeologists have begun to think about this problem. How do we confirm exactly when all of this Judeo-Christian culture really began? Now, one of these archaeologists, Jonathan Adler, in the last couple of years decided that what he was going to do is find proof of when Judaism was being practiced in archaeology, when pig bones vanish, when certain temple rituals are happening. And then he would work backwards from that point until all of that stuff stops, showing that Judaism is not being practiced anymore. So he began during the Roman times, when we know for certain that Judaism was real. And he went backwards and discovered that it only extends back 200 years. Now, this is a big problem, because the one true Torah religion that was revealed in the Old Testament and followed by the Israelites, this was supposed to be over 1,000 years older than that. And
just to point on this, the Torah, which he's citing as going back over 1,000 years, also would agree that prior to the revolution in the Hasmonean period, the predominant exercise of the Israelites, barring a few brief windows of forced compliance under certain kings, was polytheism. That's why Yahweh is always rebuking the Israelites and saying such things as, you are like an adulterous prostitute who opens her legs to everyone who passes by on the road. Which is in Ezekiel, I believe. So, yeah, that is what we would expect to see if the Bible was true, is that the faithful monotheistic religion of Yahwehism is only found consistently following the Second Temple restoration, and not with Nehemiah and Ezra in 550 BC either, because it's not long after that the Greeks come along, conquer everything, including Israel, which conceded seemingly willingly, and the people are all practicing the Greek religion. Before that, they were still in the Persian Empire, and for the most part, to get along, practicing the Persian religion. So, yeah, what he's saying is that there is not evidence of a consistent and widespread monotheistic faith prior to the Hasmonean kingdom, and that is what the Bible says was the case. So that's not really a disagreement.
instead, it's only showing up after Alexander the Great had taken over half the world and Greek culture had spread all across the horizon. This is happening as Rome are rising to their ascendancy.
Yeah, and not just after Alexander the Great, after the whole thing with Antiochus Epiphanes and whatnot, which happened about 100 years later. I'd have to check my history on that, but I think around 150 BC, so correct.
This is very, very recent. And we'll get into more conspiratorial takes by people who claim that this Torah religion, the Judeo-Christian values that are the foundation of Western culture, may have actually been formed in the bosom of the Greek Empire of Alexander, where all these Judeo-Christians were in the Grand Library of Alexandria, reading Babylonian myths and Platonism and Greek stories, and structuring their new national project, creating a noble lie, a magical mythos in order to legitimize and support this. Which may mean that Joel Berry is upside down. Western civilization did not begin in Mount Sinai. Judeo-Christian civilization did not begin in Mount Sinai. Judeo-Christian civilization began within the bosom of Western civilization. And all of this hinges on a very important moment in history, which is the Athenian Golden Age, the birth of philosophy, Socrates and Plato. You see, after the Spartan 300 fight against Xerxes in Persia, and then the Athenians finally beat him, they have this moment of wonder and victory. Out of this comes natural philosophy, the beginnings of science, democracy, theatre, this revolution in the arts and culture, this arrival of all those beautiful statues for the first time. And this sets a new cultural paradigm never before seen on Earth by mankind. Nietzsche calls this the first event in culture. Here, Plato mentions establishing a republic with high priests and mythologizing a people's past and creating this formula of 12 tribes to structure this republic. And of course, even presents in Timaeus, a very popular work at that time, the idea that there is a monotheistic one God creator of reality, the architect of this world. And the way this conspiracy goes is that centuries after this golden age, the Judeans have an opportunity to read all this and they think, this is full of brilliant ideas. Let's implement it. Let's do this. Let's take our vague, pagan national myths and morph them into something more compelling.
It's an interesting thought. I think the problem with it is that when you look at Platonism and put it up against the Torah and its view on God, these things are not the same. There is a similarity in that Plato certainly does assert a monotheistic power, the infinite and the good, from which all truth comes and which every true thing is an attempt to model. And approximation of that truth, I suppose. His whole analogy of the bed is an expression of the one true perfect idea of the bed in the divine. So there's something similar there, but to be honest, if you actually look at the two, the framing of Yahweh is much more sophisticated and clear than what Plato presented, and it's much easier to posit that Plato, having some degree of contact with the Jewish Israelites, well, not yet Jewish, but the Israelites, actually drew upon their ideas rather than the other way around. It's much more credible, I would argue, to take Plato as a corrupt emulation of the sophisticated theology of Israel than to put it the other way around. I suppose you could posit that the Jewish mystics read Plato and then adapted it into a more sophisticated model and then revised their histories. It's an argument. I don't know that it's a strong argument, but you can make it, so I'll say that.
Now, I don't expect you to take any of this on face value. What we will do in this video is go through this comprehensively. I will show you all the evidence. I will point you to the scholars so you can check it all out yourself, because this argument is actually very evidence-based. There is a lot of compelling reasons to follow this. What I'm going to do is show you a variety of different perspectives so you can really stew in the information. But for the sake of transparency, I should reveal my bias. Always keep this in mind. My main concern here is that this negation of the Western soul by these claims of Judeo-Christianity, of us Europeans not being allowed to have pride or even understanding ourselves as being a source of profound culture and civilization, leads to this guilt, this self-hate that is so common, which you see across the West. It's one of the foundations of woke, despite these anti-woke champions claiming this type of thinking. And one of the best ways you can see this is in the European Jordan Peterson. His thinking negates and demoralizes the Western soul because our culture really only came from the Middle East. We're just holding up impossible propositions and passing them on to the world. We don't have an agency, a creative source, a prophetic soul. That all came from Mount Sinai.
And you're using your great fortune at being a beneficiary of that system. Look at what we've got here, this great peace that we're inhabiting right now. You're using your the unearned gift that's been granted to you as a source of personal pride in your accomplishments due to your skin. It's like, no, not good, not a good argument. So, And that doesn't mean that, well, there's nothing valuable about European culture. There's plenty about it that's valuable. It's not even so clear to what degree it's European. I mean, it came out of the Middle East, you know. I mean, it's so muddle-headed that you hardly know where to start.
Muddle-headed is quite the apt term, and there's a lot of that going on here. So let me bring some clarity. Because Jordan Peterson has invested a lot in these impossible propositions, but it seems like they're making him sick. And this seems to define his life, the sickly, weeping philosopher.
He's also old.
And this might not have to be the case. Maybe he doesn't have to negate himself so ferociously. Maybe the truth is actually on our sides. The problem is that...
Also, if we're going to throw out aspersions based on sickness, discrediting philosophers, then, hey, Steph, you can throw that one on Nisha too, eh?
That if you really want the truth, it might destroy absolutely everything that you treasure, even your sacred illusions. So let us get into it. I hope you enjoy. This is quite an odyssey. I would buckle up. I bring in a lot of crazy things here. Archaeology, neuroscience. I'm really digging deep because this topic fascinates me. I highly enjoyed researching and making this video. I hope you enjoy it half as much. Let's do it. So let us sink our teeth into Exodus and how can we prove the historical reality of this part of the Bible? Because it is foundational to the entire mythos of Judeo-Christianity and the promise of the one true religion coming out of Judea. It has to be true for all of that to hold together, or else you're on very shaky foundations for pretty much every claim that comes afterwards. Ben Shapiro and Joel Berry are telling us that Western civilization starts at this moment. Well, did this moment happen? How do we verify it? This is the moment where Moses is in Egypt and he goes on an exodus. He takes a group of Israelites who are enslaved by the evil Pharaoh and he moves them through the desert of Sinai, upon which he gets the revelation with the 10 Commandments, brings it down to the Israelites and says, we're going to follow this religion now, put down the golden calf, get rid of all this nonsense. And then they go into the promised land and they wage a conquest with Joshua where they take the promised land for themselves. This establishes Israel as the root, and they set up the first temple and worship God in their little colony. The impossible propositions, which are a gift to all people, are revealed to the chosen, treasured people and then established in this world with a state and a temple. Well, this is where we introduce our scholars. We're going to go through a lot of different scholars today that take many different positions. For Exodus, we're going to deal with people who are moderate or maximalist. They believe most of the Bible, or at least some of it. The crazier ideas about the Greek origin of the Bible, this would be the minimalists. We will deal with this later. Now, I don't think any of these scholars would enjoy being called any of these labels. Nobody likes being a label, but this is just a general set of categories for us plebs to understand this very complicated intellectual bickering. So we have Russell Gmerkin and Jotan Adler. They will come later. They are the very fancy stuff. They're the wild stuff. The stuff that really gets your noggin clocking. But now we're going to deal with William Dever, Israel Finkelstein, who are more moderate, and Kenneth Kitchen, who believes that the Bible is pretty much entirely literal. Now, what you notice when we dive into this is that this knowledge is tied to people's most intimate identity, people's relationship with truth and God and death, and people's relationship with purpose and meaning, and also integration within a community. If you go into your evangelical church and you'll be like, wow, I just figured out the Bible's wrong. You're not going to be able to get a girlfriend and get married. You're going to get ostracized and people are going to treat you weird. The incentive for you is to lie.
Depends on the evangelical church, probably, sadly.
If you're Jordan Peterson, you've built your entire career on promoting a Bible. Are you going to show up next week and be like, actually, I have some doubts about this? Your mind will not permit you to perceive the truth if it threatens the way you operate your life. We'll get into the neuroscience of this later in more depth, but this is foundational. The part of your mind that seems to connect to collective and religious identity, the posterior medial frontal cortex, is also the part of your mind that progenerates cognitive dissonance. And that's a big problem, because truth and life are at war in your own head, and it's all tied to God and community.
And I'll just throw down, I agree with that. It works two ways also. If your identity is based on accepting and embracing non-Christian ideas and practices, then your God, because everybody has one of these, everyone has a God. It may be yourself. It, for many people, is science itself, empirical proof, etc. Then you will also ignore evidence that is contrary to what you want to see, because it will deeply affect your life and the way that you live your life. If you see evidence that this stuff is true, that challenges you then to accept that there may actually be something to it and have to confront whether or not you are in fact evil. So it does work both ways. But yes, this is a sound challenge.
It's a big issue. William Dever and Kenneth Kitchen, these men who are more convinced that the Bible's generally true, they are both from evangelical Christian backgrounds or heavily Christian backgrounds. And watching how they deal with the knowledge tells an awful lot. William Dever basically followed the archaeology and over time describes this painful experience of his identity getting destroyed and him abandoning the faith. He began to say, well, there's no persuasive way to say that Exodus happened. It did not happen. It's not true. And he couldn't reconcile this with the beliefs of the evangelical community. So he converted to Judaism. And then when he was in Judaism, he was doing this because at least it gave him some sort of identity or connection. And then he said, no, this sucks. I don't like this either. So he became a secular atheist. Now, while he was doing that, the evangelicals all called him a lost soul. He abandoned evangelical, various things like this. And Kenneth Kitchen, who is quite popular among the evangelicals, he basically runs with the idea that the evidence has not disproven enough yet. So I'm going to take the biblical narratives on faith until we have negating evidence, absolute evidence that says, no, this definitely did not happen. So Dever will accuse Kitchen of not embracing objective truth, refusing to look at the evidence with clear eyes and standing in his own bias. And Kenneth Kitchen will accuse Dever of being a nihilistic atheist who is reducing everything down to pure archaeological evidence and not allowing the romance of the story to seduce you. Now, it's important to understand this because this bias exists in you. How can we even approach the truth if we don't look at our souls, our psychology, our neuroscience, to understand how much that gets in the way of our ability to even interface with the truth and evidence? Perhaps me, the presenter here, maybe I'm too biased towards Dever's archaeology focus, and I'll explain why in a moment. Maybe I'm not allowing myself to get seduced by the majesty of the story. Or maybe the majesty of the story is a perfect tool of seduction that blinds you, switches on your cognitive dissonance, and stops you seeing reality. And I know many of you out there will chimp because of this. Maybe you're Jewish. Maybe you're a Christian who recently converted. And you will say to yourself, all right, well, I don't want this to be true. I don't want the negation of Exodus to happen. So you will twist and distort. You will refuse to look with clear eyes. And that is a big problem. You should try catch yourself doing this. Can you inspect your soul in this way? And maybe there will be atheists, pagans who are like, well, let's shut out. Let's get those Jews. Let's get those Christians. Let's shove it in their face that this is wrong. And that could cloud our judgment as well. We extrapolate too much out of too little evidence. We must always be on guard for this. And this is a very difficult thing to be on guard for. It's so intimately wrapped up with cognitive dissonance and our identities that it's almost impossible to pursue the truth. And you might say, Steph, why are you chutting out about truth so much? Get to the information. But I'm trying to tell the story right, because this is actually an incredible quest for the truth. What has the Bible been to us for the last 2,000 years? It has proposed itself as the truth in and of itself. And we've taken it for granted that that is what it was. And even people like Nietzsche would say that this had actually a profound disciplining effect upon the European mind. We read the good book, think of it as the truth, and we learn to inspect this truth, which creates focus inside of us, scribal intensity, which evolves into this unified science of Europe. But for 2,000 years, our approach to this truth has been very limited to the scriptures, to the word, to the realm of the spirit, which is very much what defined this religious age. This obsession with words and concepts and ideas. And if you doubted these ideas, you were told, first of all, theologically, that you're going against faith. And number two, politically, they would probably burn you at the stake. They would not take dissent lightly. But during the Enlightenment, we began to wrestle off this narrow thinking, and we opened up other perspectives to truth. We began reading Greek authors and historical authors and cross-examining the claims in the Bible. And this burst open the perspective taking that led to the first doubts in biblical accuracy. We have people like Ernst Renan in the 19th century who goes on to say that, okay, listen, after cross-examining a lot of different stuff, I don't think Jesus was God. I think he was a man who was very much present in a political situation and time, and he psychologizes Jesus. Nietzsche, for example, read Renan and extended this psychological thinking. But we're still trapped in the realm of words and your psychological take, your hot take, and what you think is going on inside people's heads. And this can be precise and accurate and intuitive, but it is limited. It is very prone to bias. You're going off hearsay. Is there better evidence that we can ascertain? And of course, in the 20th century, we got it. The arrival of archaeology. This is materialism. We came out of the world of the spirit and we went down into the quiet world of matter.
It's true. And archaeology, which actually destroyed the German higher criticism, which mocked the authenticity of the scripture by going out and finding that virtually every element of the story had archaeological support in not necessarily direct ways, but through the citation of events and of nations and even seismic events and things like that, which it turned out actually were true. So at the very least, you know, the archaeological efforts that were made in the 20th century ended up doing a lot more to prove the authenticity of the Bible as ancient manuscripts rather than disproving their origin. So, yeah.
Which seemed to contain no information to our ancestors, who would just look at it and, you know, maybe say, well, what can we really know about this? To the arrival of our penetrating specific science that can extract incredible amounts of information from very, very little things, like looking at a log, carbon dating it, and then being able to get a vaguely precise date. Been able to find artifacts, gather them all, and be very precise and construct a picture. Having the sophisticated societies capable of maintaining this, supporting archaeologists. This is a huge step forward, which allows us to vastly contend with the knowledge within the books. And archaeology gives us completely different forms of knowledge, because archaeology can't lie to us. Words can lie. Mud can't. Or maybe it just doesn't want to. Pottery.
Archaeology totally can lie to us because it has archaeologists in it who are interpreting a great deal about what they see in order to make a story out of rocks and, you know, scorch marks and arrowheads and things like that, and pig bones or the absence thereof, pottery shards and so on. You know, it's like archaeologists said there was no evidence for David, haha, he's mythical, until there was. So, yeah, the archaeology is a tool through which we can discern certain things about the past, but it doesn't tell us the whole story. And we can absolutely lie with archaeology because of it being done by archaeologists.
Burns, that will tell us the reality. And we can use precision to map things out much, much better. So archaeology can also call out the truth, call out the spirit, the words, the books. And deeper still, as we've gotten more into the 21st century, we've gone through the human genome revolution. Thank you, Barack Obama, for pioneering this. And this has allowed us to look into our cells and discover information hidden in our flesh. Do you think our ancients understood that there was like magic code inside our muscles? Well, all flesh contains this, and if we find bodies, which we found loads from these areas back in the dating of the biblical stories, we will be able to unearth information about the people themselves, their DNA, and we can construct stories out of this. Matter is revealing to us information that the spirit could never tell us, and this allows us to challenge the spirit heavily. Now, what I would like to contribute in this is some neuroscientific principles, because we see the likes of Nietzsche, Renan, they speculate psychological ideas and intuitively are accurate, as I said. But I even like neuroscience because this is almost like a deeper, mechanistic way of understanding our psychology. It grounds it in substructures in our brains. So it should be precise. And if neuroscience is in any way useful, it should be able to explain or at least show us some of these mechanisms that might be going on. And this is what we'll get into. The neuroscience of God, perhaps, is coming up soon. So now you see why we are gaining a higher resolution picture as we go further into the 20th and 21st century. We are unlocking different modes of knowledge that are enhancing the amount of perspectives that we have, which inevitably lead to us having higher resolution pictures. And this is why we're turning to archaeologists, because there's a lot of people out there who believe, based on historicism, reading books, reading history and putting it all together, but your cognitive dissonance is going to bend history to flatter your own soul. Things like archaeology is obnoxious. It shoves stuff in your face that you don't want to hear. Materialism is brute, but it is foundational and true. It is our European natural science that is giving us this ability for better penetrating depth. And the genetics are only brand new. And a lot of this is
the European natural science, which is derived from the Christian biblical view that there is such a thing as absolute truth and history that can be demonstrated. So, yes, it is interesting. It only developed in Christian and post-Christian worlds, and the idea that it's anti-Christian is interesting because predominantly the archaeologists were Christians, and really today a great many still are. So if not most, certainly it's a very popular Christian pursuit, and it's not antithetical to the ideals of Christianity. It's a derivation of them, I would argue.
Cutting edge. And this is why we're turning to the archaeologists to see what they say. How can their materialistic work fact check what we're being told about the Bible? What does it reveal? So the archaeologists claim that there's 3 parts of the Exodus narrative that we should be able to reliably test in order to confirm if it happened or not. The first would be the journey out of Egypt through Sinai in the desert. The second would be the arrival of these Israelites and their conquest of the promised land, which would show cities burned to the ground as they took over. And the last would be the...
Well, a few cities burnt to the ground. I think there were only 7 cities that Joshua details as being set aside for destruction. The actual command to Joshua from Moses is that the cities not be destroyed so that they can later be inhabited by the Israelites, and they can live in homes they didn't build and reap the harvests from fields they didn't plant and wine from vineyards that they did not themselves establish. So in fact, if the Bible is true, what we would expect to find is that the majority of the cities and towns and villages would not have been razed by fire. So just thought that was worth throwing in.
Evidence of a shift in the population as this new set of Israelites showed up and took over.
Which there is, by the way. I'll post a video below that is worth looking at, which does demonstrate the significant amount of archaeological support for the Exodus and the conquest, with Dr. Titus and I think it's Stephen Meyer. I could be wrong. But anyway, yeah, so we'll look at that.
And the star of this section of the show are the ancient Egyptians, because the ancient Egyptians were a military state. And like all big chimps, their concern is monitoring their territory and making sure that no other little groups are going to rise up and try to fight them. So they constantly scan all across their reality to try find people. They make mention of people. Now, from this we gain one mention of what looks to be the Israelites in the Levant about 1,000 years before Christ. This still suggests that there was an Israelite people in this area, but they weren't a state, but they were a tribe. Now, the next very good piece of evidence is that there is a group.
There's actually another stele, which is from approximately the time of the conquest of Israel, which includes mention of the wandering nomads of Yahweh, which you can find in that video that I'll post in the comments.
Group of people from the Levant, from the Promised Land, modern-day Israel, that go from there over into Egypt. And these people are named the Hyksos. These guys took over the city of Avaris and ruled from there. They brought in chariots and
no one thinks the Hyksos were the Hebrews anymore. That was a theory that some people had put forward at some point, but there's too much disagreement with the history of the Hyksos and the history of the Genesis Exodus accounts to even try to make them fit the narrative. So, no, it would be the Hapiru, which includes a much broader group than the Hebrews, but would contain them as Asiatic Semitic peoples. The Hapiru, which the what is the name of that? There's a library filled with many different records from the Egyptian pharaoh of the time of the conquest, which includes a number of requests from kings from Canaan detailing the conquest of their land by the Hapiru. And when you look into it, the details actually accord with the account of Joshua quite neatly, given the amount of fog of war and the boastings that might be made. The accounts actually line up really quite well and agree. So there is ancient evidence of a people group, Asiatic, Semitic, coming in, conquering the Canaan lands and making significant gains there and driving a lot of people out. So it isn't true to say there is no ancient evidence for that portion of things. It's quite significant, actually.
bronze weapons, and the Egyptians had to run up and kick them out after a while. Now, these Hyksos, these lads are a great candidate to be the main character. They have great main character energy. They have great riz. They have great aura. We have images of them, and they all have mushroom haircuts. They're like Looney Tunes Zoomers. They're absolute mad lads, you know, coming in here, look smacks with these very manicured haircuts on with bronze weapons and
But again, they were conquerors, which the Genesis account does not accord to the Israelites. They supposedly were invited to settle in the land and eventually became slaves. They did not at any point claim to have conquered the Delta region of Egypt.
It's dominating these Egyptians, bringing the true religion, putting down these, heathens that are all around them and establishing their fortress in the north and conquering from there. Now, throughout history, people have said that these Hyksos were obviously the Israelites. These were the people that went into Egypt. This is great, but there's a lot of problems. One, these people were conquerors, bringing in new technology and overcoming Egypt. Okay. They were not slaves who were subjugated. Mm-hmm. And this is where Deuteronomy begins to betray itself a bit, because what the story in the Bible says is that Moses is living under Pharaoh Ramses. And Ramses, we know, was in the 13th century BC, meaning that we're a couple of
I will get back to you on that.
Centuries away from when the Hyksos even left. Now, maybe Moses and all these guys are leftovers, but now what we're seeing is the chronology is all breaking down. We're having serious issues here. Now, more maximalists like Kenneth Kitchen grab onto this, but specifically lean heavy on the stories. They're very...
Yeah, sorry, so I don't know what he's talking about, where he's saying that Deuteronomy claims that Ramses is the pharaoh of Egypt at the time. So I will have to look into that.
Very historically based. And we do know that the Egyptians at this point said, oh yeah, we had slaves working on building various cities around Egypt at this time, like Ramses cities, which is mentioned in the Bible. And so this all nicely fits. But if we're trying to put this together with what archaeology we have, like, for example, the Hyksos, it just doesn't really connect. So there's a lot of sloppiness going on here. That's a bit of a frustration.
Yeah, okay. I think what he's referring to is that the city of Ramses is mentioned in, not Deuteronomy, but in Exodus and Numbers. Right, which most likely, I think most conventional biblical historians would say was a clerical change, given that Ramses came after, or else the region was called Ramses and that he took a name which also agreed with a name that was a geographical name, maybe from a previous great man, not a pharaoh, I don't know. Anyway, again, I'm not an expert, but yeah, the Bible isn't claiming that Ramses was the pharaoh at the time of the Exodus that I'm aware of.
And this is what leads us to the big tension point, the big question. All right, do we have proof of an exodus out of Egypt through Sinai? Because that is what would tell us that this story is real. Is there any archaeological proof? And there should be. Because the claim in the Bible is 600,000 to 2 million people moved through this desert. And if that was the case, they would leave stuff behind.
Yeah, and I think that number is challengeable, even within the biblical account, because the number 1,000 Aleph is also the same word for host, which is a non-specific amount of people. So when you say 600,000 Hebrews left, it's equally valid to translate that as 600 hosts of Israelites left, as well as 500s and 510s left, meaning that there were hosts and then smaller groups and a few small families, would also be agreeable to the numbers there, and a host could be as small as 100 people, because it just meant an independent grouping of people of a considerable size over 100, right? So, yeah, you could have as few as 20,000 or 100,000 and still say that fits the narrative according to the Hebrew. But so that's a legitimate criticism, that it does seem difficult to convey that there are 2 million people. I mean, the fact that they would have lived is not, because they're provided for through miracles rather than conventional means, but and many died in the desert, so they were maybe a lot fewer by the time they got there. And this is maybe the cognitive dissonance that Steph is talking about, but yeah, anyway. We can accept a smaller number without saying that the Bible is actually false.
These tribes called the Bedouin tribes in Sinai that leave artifacts, and they're tiny. Now, if there was this many people, an entire nation, and then they went and conquered this promised land, it would show.
Yeah, and that's fair, although the desert is very big and quick to bury things, but the Bedouin have left artifacts. There is a uniqueness about the account of the Israelites in the exile for 40 years in the desert, though, in that they're not hunting and gathering. They're not farming. They're not doing these things which would leave necessary evidence behind. They're eating manna which is falling on the ground. As well, there is a claim that miraculously their sandals never decayed and their clothes never wore out for the entirety of the 40 years. So there's some sort of claim of special preservation even of their material effects. In other words, they're not leaving behind vast swathes of refuse as they go, because there's some supernatural thing happening here. And you can mock that, and that's fine, but it just means it doesn't necessarily, again, discredit the account. If you want to discredit the account, the lack of there being a great deal of detritus from their passage isn't necessarily proving that, because the account claims something unique and weird, right? So, again, yes, I think it's a challenge, it's a legitimate challenge, but it's most powerfully a challenge for those who already reject the supernatural events described, right? If you do accept the supernatural events as possible, then it really isn't as powerful as you think. And that's one of the things where it isn't necessarily that we're entering into cognitive dissonances, right? It's that we have different presuppositional bases for what we expect to find.
Would be stuff littered everywhere. These Hyksos, we have loads of artifacts from them. And they don't worship Yahweh, they worship Baal, they eat pork. And this is...
And just to be clear, there is actually considerable evidence for a Semitic people in the Nile Delta. It's just not in the time that these people want it to be. It's, I think, 200 years or so earlier. So it's not that there is no evidence of them in Egypt. What you're really saying is there's no evidence of their traversal from Egypt to the Promised Land.
Really what rocked William Dever's mind. Because he said, right, I'm going to do excavations in Sinai. I'm going to go there. I'm going to map it out, and we're going to find places where we would find Moses. And look, and we're going to search as deeply as we can. And this place has been studied a lot, and they just cannot find anything. There is no evidence.
Yeah, and part of the problem, too, is we don't necessarily know where Sinai is. So when you go to Mount Sinai as it's named today, is that even Mount Sinai? There's no way of confirming that. It's just part of an oral tradition that really probably stems more from the Christian era, where the monks went looking for Mount Sinai, than it does from the early, even in Christ's day. Whether or not they even tried to identify that mountain is not clear.
Of a movement through Sinai. The enormity of the movement doesn't leave any evidence. Even if you reduce the size of the population to something more modest, they still don't have any evidence. We're running off the idea that Sinai could have happened, and just because we can't find something doesn't mean it's not true. And this is actually the line that Kenneth Kitchen takes, the more literate one. He says, all right, look.
Which, and to be fair, is not a ridiculous line to take. Like, look at the argument I mentioned earlier where, there is no evidence for King David until they found it. Just in the last 20 years, right? So, the fact that you're not finding something yet doesn't disprove that it's there. And, again, there may not be much there to find that is obviously pointing to a passage of these large number of people, probably smaller than 2 million, in part because of the strangeness of the supernatural events that are providing for them and preserving their effects. So, gotcha, but it's not necessarily discrediting the biblical account.
Absence of evidence, we can deal with that. I'm going to rely on the history until proven otherwise. This is absence of evidence. This is nothing important. But William Dever points out that this negation is enormous because it cuts the root of the most important story in history. If there was no Sinai, there was no Moses, no revelation of the Ten Commandments, no covenant to the promised chosen people. And therefore, how can these religions even stand? And this is what Black Pill Dever went there and looked. He searched. He dug stuff up. He came out empty-handed.
Yeah, and that's fair. I just would challenge that by saying that there are actually many more Christian archaeologists who went and found what they thought was sound evidence for these things. Not the sojourn in the desert, because no one's found anything. And it's generally accepted, again, we don't know where Mount Sinai was, and we don't know where to look for these things. So, yes, there was an archaeologist who became an atheist based on what he didn't find.
Now, this narrow point of evidence is quite damning, but it doesn't make much sense until you put it together with the whole picture. When you look at the problems with the Joshua conquest and, of course, the genetics we have on the Israelite people themselves. This is where you really begin to fill in the perspective that takes the scholarly position that is considered consensus. There was no Exodus. There was no Moses. The people of Israel emerged out of the Levant, out of local tribes following a pagan religion. And
again, the scholarly consensus amongst those who don't think there was an Exodus is that there wasn't an Exodus, so fair enough.
They did not come in as conquerors. There was no Joshua conquest, and there was no Exodus traveling out of Egypt. This is not what happened.
But I think the majority of the ancestors of ancient Israel and Judah had never been in Egypt. They were essentially Canaanites, displaced both geographically and ideologically. The point is, if there was no conquest by an Exodus group, there was no Exodus group. And if there was no Exodus group, there was no Exodus.
Now, the Hyksos anomaly, where you have a Semitic people conquering a part of Egypt, Dever and many other writers basically say that this was obviously a true event, but what happened much later in history is the scribes of Judea would look back at their people and their pagan myths, which would vaguely remember this conquest. We once went in and took a portion of Egypt, and then we returned perhaps, and they might say to themselves, all right, well, let's spin this into a practical foundation myth. And they turn this into Deuteronomy. So there's not reality to Deuteronomy of a large nation moving across the desert. It's a misremembering, a bending, a using of ancient memory and transforming it into something new. Meaning that Moses, Deuteronomy, the chosen people, the Ten Commandments may have been constructed later for political reasons. And this is what leads us into Israel Finkelstein, who is much more comfortable embracing this idea that scribes would bend and use history in order to suit themselves in political situation.
Yeah, the only problem with this argument is that you are assuming a really brilliant, almost incomprehensibly brilliant crowd of people that managed to construct a cohesive narrative that also contains details about places and people and events which are correlated as being true thousands of years after they happened. True in the sense that the place names are accurate to the time when the events are supposed to have happened, even though those names have long been lost to history. And only were rediscovered through archaeological efforts. So there is a great deal of real scholarly support for the ancient origins of these narratives. You can say they were modified afterwards. Of course you can say that. I mean, even Christians would agree that portions of them, I think, were amended. Names were changed in order to correlate with comprehensible names, sometimes even plainly, in particularly the Genesis account, where it's more or less said this is the modern name for this place. So anyway, we'll just keep listening.
He is a bit more controversial than Dever, and they often argue against each other. But Finkelstein is also an archaeologist who's done many digs himself and has discovered some key evidence. And he will help us clear up the other part of the Exodus story, where there was a conquest by Joshua which apparently brings in the people of Israel, Now, Israel Finkelstein did a lot of archaeological work in the hills around Jerusalem to try figure out when exactly these Israelites come in or arrive, and instead he figured out that they emerge out of these hills. They're farmers, pastoralists with sheep, with goats, and they're following their pagan religion, and they kind of just gradually evolve into more sophisticated states. There's no massive inflow of an invading Israeli force. Instead,
which is funny because that is in fact what the Bible says. So yes, they conquer according to the biblical narrative. Joshua goes in. They during his lifetime, a brief span really, because he's an old man, but some 10, 20 years, they conquer and drive out these people who come back in while he's there, and by the time of his death, they're still all mixed together, as you can see at the beginning of Judges. They don't successfully drive all these people out. They conquer portions of it. They then end up in continual combat with greater Canaanite nations, which leave them on the hilltops, hiding from these powers that take the valleys with their iron chariots and so on. And so what he's describing is what the Bible says happened. They, over 300 years or so, because there's probably some overlap in the Judges concurrently doing what's described, that the Israelites begin to form out of this fragmented group of tribes that had at one point had dominance very briefly, and then were fragmented, and at various points, drive out a particular Canaanite king in one portion, but not everywhere. And they have temporary regional dominance in areas, but they don't form into a cohesive nation until the time of Samuel that is dominant in the region, until after Samuel, really, that the establishment of the kingdom happens, and they're still at war with the Philistines and various other polities in that land until, in David's time, they effectively unify the kingdom. While also incorporating a lot of these people into the nation.
The people of Israel are the people of Canaan. They're not oppositional forces.
And here's the fun thing. If you actually look at Joshua, you'll notice that when he describes the nation of Israel, he says that he gathered, or whoever wrote the book of Joshua and recorded the events, said that what took place is that when they went in, after Jericho, Joshua gathered all the nation of Israel in order to reestablish the covenant with them. And it says very specifically, and all Israel, both foreigner and native born, sat and basically attended to the reading of the entirety of the Pentateuch and then reestablished covenant. So the interesting thing is the emphasis in the order is that the foreigner comes first, almost suggesting that there were more foreigners bound to Israel than there were direct descendants of Abraham. And, it's worth noting that Caleb seems to have been one of them, who was the other spy that was faithful with Joshua. So he was a Kenizzite, I think it was. A Kenite? No, he's a Kenizzite. And yet he was also described as being part of the, I don't recall which tribe it was off the top of my head, sorry, but one of the tribes. So they're adopting in these other people who bind themselves to Israel in common purpose and religion, even at the time of Joshua. So, yeah, we can expect an admixture of peoples with the Canaanites and with the Egyptians.
There's no replacement. There's no conquest. None of that happens. And he made this prediction. He got a bit of heat for this. But genetics came in and actually confirmed what he said in 2020. We have 73 bodies from this area, which appear over the course of the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, so a large span of time. And scientists genetically tested these bodies to see, was there a massive change? Was there an arrival of 2 million people that changed the genome, which is exactly what you would expect? And instead, none of that happens. You just see this smooth, consistent transition, and everybody in Canaan remaining remarkably similar to each other all throughout a 1,000-year period when Exodus and Joshua's conquest apparently happens.
You know, the funny thing about this is, if the biblical account is actually true, you have to keep in mind that the Edomites and the Moabites and the Ammonites, I believe, they were all also Semitic descendants of Abraham. So the idea that there is an intermingling of Canaanites and Semitic bloodlines in Canaan already is well established as being almost essential if the biblical story is true. And then if you then have a people coming in who are a mixture of physical descendants of Abraham along with Egyptians who also would have been intermingling with the Canaanites because the Canaanites were vassal states, and intermingled with the Canaanite people because they didn't conquer them all. They did intermarry with them, which is testified to in the scripture. Then, surprise, surprise, what you get is a very similar genetic picture. So, again, that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't disagree with the biblical account as it stands.
Israel Finkelstein was vindicated. This is brutal, and it cuts the legs out from beneath the Joshua conquest.
It doesn't.
And this is something that people resisted because initially there were archaeological discoveries that seemed to confirm the Joshua. When the Zionists initially seized Israel in the 1940s, they began to do some archaeological digs because they wanted to discover what was the truth. And they actually found one of the cities mentioned in Joshua's conquest, Hazor, and they discovered that it had been eviscerated in flames. It had been burned to pieces at some point, destroyed, which is exactly what Joshua did in the Bible. And this was great. This showed proof of concept. The history is real. We were conquerors before, and we're back. But over time, as they excavated the other cities mentioned, because remember, there's a lot of cities that get torched by Joshua, they discovered that it probably didn't happen. In fact, a lot of these cities, sometimes they don't exist, they're unoccupied, or they're untouched during this period. And this becomes a major issue. The most famous, of course, is Jericho. They discovered that Jericho is just not really, there was no conquest there at all. It might not even have had the walls that apparently were pulled down by Joshua.
Oh dear, come on. Yeah, so what they found at Jericho was that the walls all fell down outward at a certain point, except for one tiny section of the wall. That the city had been taken, that the stores of grain were left behind, just like is recorded in Joshua. And then some lady came along and said, the carbon dating's wrong for that, so it doesn't fit when I say they should have entered, so it doesn't count, and everybody's ignored it, except, not willful disbelievers ever since. Okay.
And actually, of something like 14, 15 sites that apparently Joshua conquered, only 2 of them showed any evidence of a destruction, which further makes us think, why should we assume that it was the Israelites who did this?
Yeah, and again, most of those sites would not have showed signs of destruction because they were not supposed to destroy the cities according to the decree of Moses and the account of Joshua. Now, you could certainly say they're just making an excuse and saying, yeah, we weren't supposed to destroy those, and the people living in them, we actually did drive them out, but then they came back. Sure. Fine, you can say that, but it still doesn't disagree with the narrative of Scripture.
There was also a large invasion taking place at this time from, for example, the Sea People. This happened the same time, apparently, these Israelites come in. So why are we assuming that it was the Israelites when it doesn't match the story? So as archaeology has rolled forward in the 20th century, even up to the gene studies we're seeing in our time, there has been actually a breakdown of this myth. People have become less convinced as time has gone forward, and people...
Sure, except for all the reasons I just pointed out, that none of this evidence actually disagrees with the biblical accounts.
like Israel Finkelstein put their neck out and be like, yeah, I don't think it happened quite that way, and they get heat. In fact, William Dever once called Finkelstein a post-Zionist, which is quite fascinating because what is Finkelstein doing? He is an Israeli Jew. He works out of Tel Aviv, and he's subverting the mythos of the conquering Zionist promised land. Now, Finkelstein is quite interesting because he is trying to present himself as a secular Enlightenment atheist, a proper European scientist. And maybe personally he has his beliefs about God, but he's trying to do the science the correct way, to follow the evidence to the letter. And people give him heat for this. They say he's a bad Jew. He's not protecting the aura of the Zionist project. He's getting grilled by an evangelical American for this. And this is how serious this topic is. The truth causes pain. It hurts. It hits on tender points. It creates identity crises. It is related to our spirituality. In fact, it's the foundation of our belief in God and the future and our hope for the world. And if you take that away from people, it causes problems. The Zionist political project from Finkelstein's own people hinges on this idea that this is their promised land. And to pull that away, to use archaeology to undermine this, is very dangerous, especially now that they're in a war. And so we have this crisis of conscience where we want to tell the truth, perhaps, be a good scientist, but that might involve us going against identity, going against political pragmatism, going against the needs of life itself.
So this is not history in the simple sense. And the case of Jericho applies also for other places mentioned in the tradition of the conquest in the book of Joshua. Many of the cities mentioned were not inhabited at all in the late Bronze Age. There was nothing there.
So in summary...
And just to respond to that, I think what you will find if you're looking into this is that a lot of these archaeologists, I'd have to look into what Finkelstein himself is arguing, they tend to be basing their dismissal of these accounts on an assumption that this took place later than biblical archaeologists would say that it did, by like 200 years at least, sometimes 400 years. So they're looking in a place where these towns were not inhabited. Well, maybe they're not inhabited because you're looking 200 years after the people were driven out of them and they fell into decay, right? So, again, it's... everybody has biases, and archaeologists are not exempt from having biases. If you start on a presupposition that I know when things happened, and I don't find evidence in this place and time that I know that they happened, therefore it didn't happen. But there is evidence for the same things happening 200 years earlier. Maybe your date's off, right? But, okay.
We've always had to take writings and words on face value because we've had no other good avenues for knowledge. As we've fallen into the materialist age, we've opened up archaeology, and as that has progressed, we've gained genetics in recent years. This has given us a much broader perspective and has allowed us to contrast and fact-check the stories. And most of the moderate archaeologists say to us that the foundation of the Exodus myth, which is the foundation of the biblical idea of God giving a true religion to Moses, doesn't seem to hold much water. There was no conquest of the promised land by Joshua. There was no wandering through the desert in Sinai. There were interesting anomalies like a Hyksos group, which probably is loosely the basis of these stories. And the Israelites, the Jews, do come out of the promised land, out of Canaan. They emerge out of it, not as conquerors, but out of local tribes.
Okay, I think I'll probably have to stop it there. The Amarna Library is the library that contains all the letters, not letters really, they're on clay tablets or whatnot, but basically recording the events as having happened the way that Joshua says, but in the wrong time, of course. So what the skeptical archaeologists do with that is they say, well, obviously these Hapiru couldn't have been the Hebrews because they're in the wrong time or something. I appreciate what you're doing here, Steph, and I'm not trying to mock as I laugh. It's these are legitimate challenges, and I think they should be accepted and not cast aside in a cognitive dissonance, as you say, because they disagree with beliefs. I think it's just overly simplistic. I think that if you actually examined those who argue for the authenticity of Scripture being demonstrated by archaeology a little more carefully, and I'm not trying to suggest you haven't done very deep research, and I'm impressed by what you've put together, but I think what you will find is that there are credible answers to a lot of this, maybe not for the evidence of the Israelites in the Sinai or the Saudi Peninsula, which is where they were probably actually wandering, which makes it a bit more difficult because they passed through the Sinai. Whether or not Mount Sinai is actually on the Sinai Peninsula as we know it today it's quite questionable. But either way, that's a credible challenge. I'll accept that we don't yet have any evidence for this passage of this large group of people. But as for the rest, to say that you can say definitively about the genetics and the contemporary evidence on a few cities, when there is actually really strong, compelling evidence about Jericho having fallen in the way that is recorded, I guess for me that doesn't really require a great deal of cognitive dissonance. But I think I'm going to close this right now, and I will get back to it. It's just really long, so I see 2 hours left, and I'm going to try to get back at this and give it another shot and give it the response that it deserves for the amount of effort that's been put into it. So thanks a lot, and this old man is signing out of his shed for now. Cheers.